I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. On this week's episode, I'm joined by Tommy Orange, author of the new novel Wandering Stars. 6 years ago, he published his tremendous debut, They're There, a polyphonic look at a dozen Native American characters, all living in modern-day Oakland, California. They're There was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in fiction, and maybe as importantly, who's to say? It was also one of the New York Times' 10 best books of the year. The new book, Wandering Stars, is a sequel. It picks up with some of the characters who we left off with at the dramatic end of They're There, which, spoiler alert, we talk about just a little bit, but it also goes back in time to their ancestors in the aftermath of the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre. Tommy Orange, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Gilbert.
Tell us about Wandering Stars.
Okay, so Wandering Stars there's different names that I've heard in the copy for the book, and based on the initial reactions to it, people are calling it a sequel and a prequel and a follow-up and a standalone, and it's this funny thing with how things get marketed and talked about. I definitely started writing it as a straightforward sequel, and so like literally picking up where they're left off, like actually at the Coliseum, where the final pages of the book where it ends. But the book became something else. It took me 6 years to write. We start off all the way back in 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre. There's a young man fleeing that scene, and that comes from a family story. How my dad got his name is from a similar story. And we end up following generations all the way until we get to Orville Redfeather, and that's his family is a family from They're There. And so we follow this family line through fleeing from the massacre, getting to a prison castle in Florida, where Richard Henry Pratt comes up with the idea for the boarding schools. The son of somebody there, the same boy who flees the massacre, his son ends up going to the Carlisle boarding school. And we just follow several generations until it leads us all the way back to the end of They're There. And that is, in a way, also a young man fleeing a shooting and him figuring out how to recover from that, and his whole family together. They're all figuring out how to recover from what that was. So we sort of follow their journey through the attempt at recovering.
Before I ask you a little about the history of the boarding schools that you first referenced, I'd love to know if you can remember, when did you realize that you were going to continue the story of Orville Redfeather? When did you know there's more to say about this character, his brothers, his grandmother, and everyone else in his world?
So it was in March of 2018. This was a couple months before They're There came out. I started writing the sequel. And there was something powerful to me about Orville's story, being dressed in full regalia, dancing, and being at this sort of cultural event and having this shooting interrupt it, and him actually getting shot and having to figure out how to come back from that. I just felt there was a lot of layers to explore, the way that could echo the way Native people think about history, and how complex and confusing it is to figure out how you feel about things like historical trauma, and the way we do or do not talk about history in American classrooms and as an American society on the whole, and the way that we're depicted or not depicted in popular culture. It just felt like there was a lot to explore, just the idea that he was recovering from getting shot. And, somebody recovering from a mass shooting situation is also, it felt like there was a lot of material there. And we hear about shootings all the time, obviously, but we hear a number and probably more coverage on who did the shooting, and we don't really follow the story of what it's like to come back from something like that. So it felt like there was something there to write about that would feel like a continuation from themes I was exploring in There. Orville's family was just one of the more core families in There.
Let's talk a little bit about the past. I think one of the reasons that how to refer to this book is a little all over the place. Is it a sequel? It's a prequel. It's a sequel that also partly takes place in the past, is how I've been thinking about it. But one of the Interesting things is the story of Orville's ancestors and the residential school that they went to, in which there was a system of essentially trying to beat the Native American elements out of them to make them into a more assimilated white person in America. When did you decide, and how did you learn about that part of American history?
In February 2019, I was in Sweden for the translation of there into Swedish, and they had invited me to a museum because they had Southern Cheyenne stuff there. And they're like, do you want to see the stuff? And so I'm getting this like meta tour from this curator about how they know how wrong it is that they have it, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. And I see a newspaper clipping that has Southern Cheyennes in Florida in 1875. And I know enough about our tribal history to know that we were never in Florida. And so I fall down this rabbit hole and discover that basically the origin story of boarding schools starts at this prison castle with these prisoners of war from 1875 to 1878. Richard Henry Pratt was the jailer. This prison castle. It's the site of the first European colony in the United States. There's a lot of talk in history classes obviously about Jamestown and Plymouth. And we don't talk about this one because it was Spanish, but it was still the first European colony. Anyway, it traded hands over the years and eventually ended up in U.S. hands and was called from San Marcos, like castle, turned into this Fort Marion prison castle. He Christianizes them and militarizes them. And this 3-year period, he realizes that the work he was doing was effective, and he thought he was saving these people, and decides, why not? Let's do the same thing to the children. And I don't know where he made that jump from like prisoners of war who are adults to like, let's do the same thing to all the children. It's a pretty cruel, kill the Indian, save the man. It's a pretty cruel thing that was happening. But my tribe is Southern Cheyenne. And when I realized that my tribe was tied, because half of the prisoners there were Southern Cheyennes, my tribe was tied to this part of history, even though it's not a great part of history. It's an important one that a lot of people don't know about. Most Native people know about this harrowing history of boarding schools and how long it went on and how damaging it was for us. But a lot of people who aren't Native don't know this story. And while I was doing the research, I didn't necessarily know if it was going to tie into what I was working on. But I found a list of the prisoner names, and I'd already started working with the material, the historic material, working on a fictional thing, and was calling one of the characters Star. And one of the actual prisoners there, his name was Star, and another prisoner's name was Bear Shield. And that's one of the families from there. And when I saw that, I realized I was going to write a generational story that connects through this family line from the Sand Creek Massacre all the way to the aftermath of the powwow from there.
What was the process like of writing historical characters? So much of there is contemporary or near contemporary in a place that you live in Oakland. And this was a bit of a bigger swing going back in time, part of the country that you did not grow up in. What was that like in terms of the practicalities of writing character?
Yeah, there was a lot of research that I had to do. I don't end up including that much research, but I have to immerse myself in the time period to convince myself that I can write from that perspective. A lot of my work is character driven, and there's a lot of interiority happening. But in order to get back to the page and try to find real characters through revision, I definitely needed to read a lot about this big time period, 1864 to we get all the way up to 1940s in the first 100 pages of the book. So there was a lot of research I had to do.
When you say finding characters through revision, what does that look like?
It is figuring out the unique syntax and weird little obsessions they have and things that make them feel real. I never wanted to write historical fiction. So I didn't want to just throw together a collection of facts about this actual person and have them like walk through a space or whatever, have something happen to them. I got drawn in by this part of history because it was so specific to my tribe. And I don't necessarily love reading historical fiction, but But if it's driven from the interior and it's character driven, it's compelling to me. So figuring out the types of humans they might have been or things they might have thought or felt, that was a way for me to try to figure out how to make them real. And that's sometimes on a sentence level and sometimes on a, like, what are their motivations or what are they doing in their day-to-day lives? What do they want? That kind of thing, trying to figure out those kind of things in the revision process.
The first third of the book that you talk about, which is the sort of historical section, is, at least when I read it, it seemed largely dialogue-free. And, the rest of the book is relatively dialogue-free compared to other novels I would think of this length. I'd love to hear how you choose when to utilize dialogue and when not, because so much of your prose and the power of your prose is really in these almost stream of consciousness, extremely interior descriptions of what someone is thinking and how they're moving through the world.
Part of why I love fiction is because of what it can do with the interior. I think I know that the reader loves scene work and dialogue, and that is like a grounding thing. And what characters say, what they end up saying to each other really matters for character development. But what draws me to writing fiction has more to do with the interior. I think we have great TV and great movies, and that's all dialogue or mostly dialogue and action and not necessarily very much interior stuff. I like to work with what fiction alone can do. That's what first drew me to reading. And that's where the writing always starts from. It always starts from the interior. How I pick and choose, I just try to create a balance. Maybe I have more interior than a writing teacher might suggest that I have in a novel. Maybe it could have been balanced better. But that is just where this one was coming from. And like I said, I try to balance and put in scenes and have stuff happen. But I do have a lot of interior stuff here, and that is just how this one came out.
In a bit of a meta moment later in the book, two characters are talking about the movie Donnie Darko, and their exchange goes, "What about the sequel?" And then the other character says, "It was really bad, like I couldn't even finish it." And first character says, "That bad?" Second character says, "I think most sequels are bad." Did you have concerns going into this with that in mind, that a sequel is getting into dicey territory? You're picking up a story that so many people loved in the case of They're There and really trying to keep it going.
I'm still worried. The book's not out yet. I must hate myself because it was already, the sophomore effort's already sort of doomed, or people want to see the spectacle of like the failure after the success. And then to have it be a sequel, I definitely felt the pressure and lots of like horrible days where I could not figure out why I had committed to this. And this was like long after it was like a contract. I sold the book in 2020 and there's no going back at a certain point. And so I had lots of days of regret and like, what did I get myself into? And so the book comes out tomorrow, and there's been a lot of waiting, because between the time you finish and the time the book comes out, there's a lot of waiting. And there's a lot of fear around like, I just didn't want to do the same thing again. And I think sometimes sequels try to recapture what they did the first time. And I didn't want to write the same book. And my editor didn't want that for me either, which was really helpful, the way that she helped guide me away from that. So definitely felt the pressure, and hopefully it won't be read that way as bad.
One of the big themes of this book, and it's such a big theme that you mention it in the dedication, is really the theme of addiction, which you touch on in there. But so many of the characters, whether it's the historical characters dealing with liquor or laudanum, or the contemporary characters dealing with pain medication and other types of drugs, and thinking about addiction, realizing they're addicted, and still not being able to extricate themselves from that situation. Talk to me a little bit about that theme as one of the undergirding elements here in this book.
Well, I think for Native people, as much as we hate the stereotype of, let's say, the drunk Indian, which everyone knows, it's in the ether or whatever around Native people, it felt to me, just because of the life that I've lived, the family that I have, it's just marked my life in ways and shaped my life in ways that I felt I was always going to be writing about it, because you end up writing what affects you. And I also wanted to write about the complexity of it. And a lot of times it's written about or talked about as a moral failing and not as a symptom for something deeper going on. So I really wanted to lay the groundwork for all of the deep stuff that might be going on that people are going to these drugs about to try to feel better, because there's a lot of weight and a lot of pain in Native history, and addiction can sometimes be the medicine that people have to go to. And so I wanted to write about it in a way that with compassion and with understanding and complexity. And like I said, it's also a very personal thing.
Do you feel like you've read other fiction, and I'm not asking you to name names, of course, in which addiction is like a plot or a beat as opposed to something that the author is actually really trying to sort of walk their characters through?
There's a lot of fiction that kind of romanticizes the alcoholic writer that sometimes doesn't read very real to me, or I don't relate to it as much. There's sort of like the Hemingway or on the romanticized drug side of things, like the Hunter S. Thompson. There's this way of talking about it like that's just what writers do. And then there's also like you said, the beat of like, that was a problem and then recovery saved me. And without really going into the why as much as sometimes I hope to read. I think somebody like Dennis Johnson writes about addiction in a really compelling way, and he's been a big influence. So yeah, I wanted to do something different than what I've seen with the addiction story.
You graduated from college with a degree in sound engineering, and I'm wondering what, if anything, you learned from working with sound or playing music that you have brought to your writing in terms of style, in terms of rhythm, in terms of tempo, anything like that. Are there stuff that sort of can transfer from one to the other?
Yeah, I think I was transformed by my education in sound. It really makes you think about the world differently. My musical tastes were expanded, just my education about the history of music. And I started writing pretty much right after I graduated with that degree. And I didn't realize for a while how much listening to the sound of sentences was a part of my revision process. That's a sonic element that I can't do without. There's no final drafts of my work that haven't gone through intensive periods of reading the sentences out loud and really thinking about how they sound. And the final check to me, whether or not I think the sentence is ready or okay enough to let it go, is a sonic evaluation more so than reading it over and over again. The reading it part is really earlier revision. And then there's a lot of reading out loud, which is painful. I don't necessarily love doing it, but it's an important part to me of figuring out where the work's at.
Do you have to listen to the audiobook versions of this? And do you have input into how words are falling, the sort of the tempo in which they're coming out?
I do. I'm actually listening to it now. I got it a little bit early, and I'm really happy with the performances. And I got to do auditions. They sent me files, and I got to hear different actors, and I got to pick who it would be.
You would never have read it?
No, because I actually love the listening experience so much, and if I read it, I never would have listened to it.
I think a lot of people feel that way. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm here this week with Tommy Orange, author of There and his new novel, Wandering Stars. Tommy, I have read so much in these two books about Oakland, a city I've been to briefly while visiting San Francisco, but it is the lifeblood of so many of your characters. What does it mean to you now that you've actually put it down on paper and shared the city with so many readers?
I feel really proud that I have been able to express my love for Oakland through story and through character. I love the city because it's my home and it's where all my memories live. I think it's a really special town. There's a lot of history here, and there's 10 million New York novels. There's not that many about Oakland, and that's not because the city's not worthy. I think it's more of a reflection of the publishing industry living in New York and it wanting to hear its own stories. New York's obviously an amazing city, and Oakland's very tiny compared to it. So I was just wanting to represent where I'm from in a way that expressed its complexity and my love for it, and through character and story, like I said. So I feel good, and I've gotten good responses from people from Oakland. So that also feels good.
Tommy, in the acknowledgments of your book, you call out Kaveh Akbar, a debut novelist whose book Martyr came out last month, to very positive reviews. We gave it a positive review. He's a poet, but this is his first novel. And I'm curious, as someone who's working on their second novel, what advice did you give him about putting a book out into the world? What advice and notes did he give you about language, given that he's a poet? I'm always curious about the relationships between writers.
Yeah, so we met in 2019 and essentially wrote our books together. The fact that they came out a month apart from each other, and we're both at Knopf and have the same editor, was just some crazy, if you want to call it, coincidence. We exchanged pages most Fridays. We had a routine, and mostly we are pointing out what is going right. It's not exactly like a writing workshop. It's really when we're generating new work and needing to keep each other motivated. So definitely when he points out stuff where the language is beautiful, I get lit up because he's such an incredible writer about language and an incredible writer to itself. He would claim that I was teaching him narrative things, but he was also studying it intensely from movies and graphic novels, and just dedicating himself to novels and preparing himself to write the beautiful novel that he wrote. Mostly we are encouraging each other because we both, as most writers, face great doubt and don't want to get stuck in not writing at all. So that mostly we're just like in each other's corner to try to keep momentum.
When you think about or reflect on the word assimilation, which is something that, of course, the characters in your novels have to think about given their place in America, what does that mean to you in terms of how you see yourself as a writer in the world of fiction here in America? You talk about living in Oakland and the publishing industries in New York, but you're also a native writer in an industry that thankfully has more and more of them, but still really doesn't have a ton relative to the amount of books that are published every year. Like, how do you see yourself vis-a-vis that reality?
I think it's a really exciting time for Native representation. There was, even when we have had previous Native renaissances, it was still like wanting the old stories and for us to be historical. And I did an interview with Wes Studi, one of our most famous Native actors, and he talks about how he's kept working all these years. He calls it leathers and feathers, because that's who he constantly gets paid to be an actor as. So I think, it's a tricky thing writing about urban natives, because it's not a story about anything recognizable as a cultural group tied to like one specific way. The story is one of relocation and assimilation, and then finding each other and commonality and living in cities and starting up these urban centers and creating an intertribal community. It's complex because we don't want to be a monolith. We don't want to be considered the same, because we are 4 federally recognized tribes and like 400 maybe not federally recognized tribes. That's a lot of nations, and there's a lot of diversity across the country and in the Americas when it comes to indigenous people. I wanted to tell this urban native story and have it just be this one about Oakland, and I'm not trying to speak on behalf of Native people in general. There's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of infighting around authenticity and us being authenticated from the outside. And things that might look like assimilation can sometimes, like in my generation, a lot of people in my age, there was a strength in blending in and not standing out. Like my dad speaks fluent Cheyenne. It was his first language, but he didn't raise us speaking the language. He made a decision that has to do with maybe they'll be stronger if they fit in better. And that is assimilation at its finest, and maybe not something that he would have done again had he rethought it. And we live in different times now, and there's a lot more appreciation for culture, and there's a lot more appreciation for teaching language and for keeping language alive.
Yeah, it's almost assimilation out of what it sounds like he thought was a good intent. But as the child that has to deal with that intent, maybe part of you is like, it would have been nice to know that language.
Yeah, in language, there's so much embedded about a cultural worldview, life ways are embedded in language. So you understand your tribe better if you know your tribe's language. And we started learning during the pandemic over Zoom. He's one of like 5 of our fluent language speakers left in for the Southern Cheyenne dialect. He grew up speaking the language in the house. My mom is white and she didn't speak Cheyenne. And he worked a lot too. So the opportunity for us to be able to learn it also was not exactly there.
Tommy, a segment that we sometimes have on the podcast is the book I've read the most, in which we ask our guests to talk about a book that they have returned to over and over again over the course of their life. And you have chosen the book Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector, the Brazilian writer. I have a ton of questions about this book, which I read this weekend for the first time. So thank you for introducing me to it. Tell us a little bit about the book, what it's about, and then when you first encountered it.
Well, it's a convenient one to return to again and again because it's a very short one.
Thank you for picking a short one.
That's part of why I love it. I really love novella length stuff. There's something really nice about around 90 pages. So Clarice is some kind of patron saint of literature. I'm not sure what her designation would be. She's a mystical writer. She's funny. Hour of the Star is her last work before she died. I would say it's her best. It's also the best entrance into her work. A lot of her other stuff is a little bit more difficult and more mystical and maybe less humorous in tone. Basically, it's about a writer writing about a character named Macabea, and it's very much a book about writing itself, about strange cosmic musings. We see what happens to this typist. Clarice does not, and the writer does not think highly of her in a funny way, in a sad way. And it ends in a kind of cataclysmic way, which she talks about. She's very transparent as a writer. Know that she's there, but you're also, there's a sort of a nestling doll situation where it's Clarice writing as this writer who's a man writing about Macabea. And then as you continue into the book, you more are in the story, but the entrance into the book may turn people off. And it's what made me love the book is it's this really grand and cosmic stream of consciousness, fantastical interior style that is full of voice. And there's just nothing else like it. There's nobody out there who writes like Clarice Lispector.
And when did you first get this book? Did someone give it to you? Did you pick it up on your own?
My reading path, especially early on, was a very lonely one because I found reading on my own. I was working at a used bookstore, was not really even a reader when I was hired. And the book that led me, so books would just lead to books, or I would just wander. This bookstore that I worked in or other bookstores, I was really getting into fiction for the first time. I read Epitaph of a Small Winter by Machado de Assis. And this is a sad origin story for how I discovered Clarice. It was one of Amazon's early algorithms for book recommendations. So I had bought this other book. I think I found Machado de Assis in the bookstore, but not the not Epitaph of a Small Winter. I think I ordered that through Amazon. And here I am working at a used bookstore and I'm using Amazon. It's also sad. But this was way before Amazon became the giant corporation that it is now. So it recommended Hour of the Star because I had ordered this other Brazilian writer, and it made me like trust the algorithm and probably use Amazon more at that time than I should have, because I loved the recommendation. So that was like when I was starting to think about my writing voice and what did that look like? What style did I want to write in? And for me, a lot of reading as a writer is about the feeling that you're being given permission. And I feel like with Clarice and her style, I was given permission. I'm not sure what she gave me permission to do, but there's something liberating about people that are as bold as her and writing with as much stylistic flair, and also about very deep and mysterious things about existence.
How many times would you guesstimate that you've read this book?
Maybe 5 or 6. I mean, I read it initially when I found it, and this was maybe 2006. I was in a book club with my not yet wife, where we met at the Native American Health Center in Oakland. And there was a failed book club that ended up just the two of us. And one of the early books, my recommendation was that book. I read it again during the pandemic. I read her biography by Benjamin Moser. I've read almost all of her other books. And then I read it again recently for this.
What did your wife think about the book?
Oh, she loves it. I mean, we have a reverence. Oh, there's another time we read it in New Mexico, Hour of the Star, maybe 2 or 3 years, 4 years after the initial time that we read it. So we hold Clarice in reverence, just a special place in our hearts.
So nice. You should frame a copy and put it up in your living room. It's one of the pieces of literature that brought you together.
Absolutely.
What would you say is a way in which the book has influenced your own writing? I mean, there are so many beautiful, funny, odd little passages here, and it's translated by Benjamin Moser. Is that correct? Who also did the biography?
I've read more of the original translation, which I think happened in the 70s or 80s. And the Benjamin Moser is the more recent translation. There's been a Clarice explosion in the past decade. New Directions has like put out new versions of her book and her complete stories, which is like a massive book. But yeah, the more recent one is Benjamin Moser.
Yeah. What have you learned as a writer from even something as slim as this 80-page book?
I don't know that there's a one-to-one, like I learned this and this is where it might show up in my work. It had more to do with a love of somebody doing something as daring as her in her work, especially in Hour of the Star. And like I said earlier, this sort of permission to try to do something with fiction that only fiction can do. There's this sudden, like, she'll ask a question, and maybe this does show up sometimes in my work. She'll ask a question, and it was one of the first times a book made me not laugh out loud, but there's like this interior laughing inside, but feels like a laugh out loud feeling. She'll just on a dime, she'll just ask a question that is funny. It's not totally clear why. It's in the timing. And she consistently asks those questions and as an opportunity to infuse humor and change tones. And I think that's something that I've seen myself try to do. I'm not going to say that I pulled it off.
There's also something that is funny, if we can use that word here, about the author who's writing the story. This author just so much does not want to get started writing this story. And he is procrastinating. He's like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to tell this story, but I feel like I have to tell this story. And then he interrupts himself while telling the story to say, are they going to get married? I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. And all the sort of interjections that this guy is putting in also made me feel like, God, it's even writing something this short, it's got to be hard, because you literally can do anything other than write a novel.
Yeah, and I think the trick to writing something readable and to engaging a reader is to never show the effort on the page. And I think one of her tricks at this entry point into this novel is to, in a funny way, poke fun at all that throat clearing and hesitation and psychic blocks that you go through in the writing process. And that's part of why I love it too. It very much feels like a book written for writers.
There's a line that the writer writes in the book. He says of Macabea, "I'm the only one who finds her charming. Only I, her author, love her. I suffer for her." And I've never written a novel, but I imagine that line reflects something about how a writer sort of communes with their characters, these people that didn't exist before they put them on the page.
I think the amount of time that you have to spend with your own writing, yes, but with a character and thinking about how to make them real has to do with separating yourself from them. Definitely every character is influenced by who I am and my writing style and my experiences. But I think the amount of time and effort it takes to try to render a character who feels real to the reader so that they feel it, it takes this great effort. And your characters spend a lot of time in your head with you, and you're thinking about what are the best decisions to make on the page to make these people feel real. So it's a big challenge. And again, I think she kept this meta layer of the writer telling you how he feels about the character he's going to tell you about in a second once he says something else about the character. There's a lot of great moments like that.
Other than bringing it to what sounds like a very fateful book club gathering, have you ever given this book as a gift or loaned it out to others?
Yeah, I definitely have. My best friend got a copy very early on. Usually if I love a book, I give it away. I have a lot of books in my collection that I haven't read or I didn't necessarily love because usually if I really love a book, I feel like I begin proselytizing about it.
Tommy Orange, The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector was a great read for me. Thank you again for picking a short one. I think all of our listeners should check it out. Thank you for coming on to talk about this book that you've read the most in your life. And of course, thank you for joining us to talk about Wandering Stars.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
That was my conversation with Tommy Orange, author of Wandering Stars, the sequel to his 2018 book, There. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.